Hi, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Aleš Ernitzel. I'm a Slovenian philosopher, ex-journalist, and a podcaster. And I'm honored that a prolific historian, J. Otto Pohl, accepted my invitation. Otto is of ethnic German origins, but he was born in America. And it's probably the best for all of us that he actually presents himself, his academic path, his scholarly path. And as I said, I'm honored that you accepted my invitation, Dr. Pohl. Happy to host you at my podcast. Hi.
Hello.
So tell us something about you yourself. Where you were born, where did you finish your education, you got your academic reference, and so forth?
Yeah, I was born in Boston kind of by accident because my father was doing his degree at MIT. Otherwise, my parents, they grew up in Sacramento in California. And then I went to college in Grinnell College in Iowa. And then there's a big gap. But during that gap, I do write two academic books, The Stalinist Penal System and Ethnic Cleansing in the USSR, 1937 to 1949, which are published in 1997 and 1999. And then in 2001, I went to do graduate work at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London and received my PhD from there in 2004. And then there's another big gap. I was mostly living on my uncle's ranch in Arizona, but in 2007, I got a job at American University Central Asia in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, and I was there until the end of 2010, and from 2011 to 2016, I was at the University of Ghana in Legon, Ghana, outside of Accra, the capital city. And then I was in Sulaymaniyah in the Kurdish region of Iraq from 2016 to 2019. And I returned to the U.S. in 2019. I finished writing the book in 2021 and was published in 2022, but I have not had an academic position since 2019 when I left Iraqi Kurdistan.
When you were growing up, did you have any German upbringing? Did you speak German at home? I mean, it's obvious American English is your mother tongue, but
a little bit, but not a whole lot. So my grandfather, whose native language was German, didn't like to speak it, although he still understood it. He still kept a lot of German recipes. He loved to cook, so he had, and they weren't traditional German recipes. They were German recipes that had obviously had Polish and Ukrainian influence from where his father and grandfather came from. So, for instance, halupsi is a common Ukrainian dish, but it's also one that we got growing up with my grandfather, the stuffed cabbage leaves, or sometimes stuffed peppers. Though it wasn't like a whole lot. With later on, my aunt hooked up with some of our German relatives still in Germany that had done a lot of the genealogy. So I wasn't really aware beyond my great-great-grandfather, but looking at what they put together now, it goes back all the way to, I think, 6 generations back, and it goes to Poznan before they start moving east across what is now.
What did motivate you to go into research you did as a scholar, which is obviously a lot about Germans in USSR?
Yeah, that had only vaguely to do with my own ethnic heritage. Growing up, my neighbors were Lithuanians, and they were very active in the movement to restore independence in the 1980s and into the 1990s when they were finally successful. And this got me very interested in Soviet nationality policies, the non-Russians within the USSR. And as I furthered my education, I became more and more interested in going further east. And so things like the deportation of the Chechens and Crimean Tatars and Kalmucks. But when you start to deal with national deportations, and a lot of stuff started coming out 89, early 90s from Russia and then other republics, Kazakhstan in particular, because they are the largest group, the amount of material on the Germans is much, much larger in the terms of archival holdings as well as secondary sources. Scholars, not only Germans from Russia, who for a while were the leaders in places like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Russia, writing about, but even later ethnic Russians, people like N.F. Bugai, and now there are a number of ethnic Kazakhs that write about the subject. The other thing was for just being able to use the sources. If I didn't want to do just everything in Russian, I already knew German, but it wasn't going to be easy to learn a Turkic language like Crimean Tatar or Karachay or Balkar, and probably even more difficult to learn something like Kalmuk, which is a Mongol language. So that was also a consideration, as was the fact it was modern history and they were using typewriters, because handwritten Cyrillic is awful to read.
Yeah, I know. I know. My mother is of Macedonian ethnic origin, and they use the Cyrillic also, but I don't know. I knew it kind of when I was little, but nowadays I can't even read it. Or I can read it, but very slowly. Uh, but Russian is probably even harder to read. I don't know.
I don't know. The little bit in Slovenian was identical to Russian except the lettering. If you had just phonetically put it in Cyrillic, it would have been identical to how you would have said that in Russian. So evidently there are parts of Slovenian that are similar enough to Russian that they can be made out.
Some people say that these languages are very similar, that the majority of the differences are basically phonetical, not semantical or whatever. But to be honest, I don't know. I haven't been able to learn Russian or Czech or Slovak languages, which are Slavic languages and are supposed to be similar to to
Well,
Slovene.
yeah, I can understand because I even have trouble with Ukrainian, and that's the closest to Russian. But when you start to read it, one, they got extra letters in there, but two, they throw in all these weird Polish words which are only exist in Polish as a Slavic language. So, like, you know, the weirdest one I think is every Slavic language pretty much the word for tea is chai,
Yeah,
but in Polish it's herbata.
never heard of it. Interesting. Yeah, they probably this Slavic tribes or little nations or ethnicities. They always have this small wars or conflicts with each other, and they want to distance themselves from each other, and then they often they made up some words, and then it becomes even more difficult to learn all of them. Although I'm not sure if all the Slavic languages are come from the same origin. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the only one I'm competent in is Russian. So even Belarusian and Ukrainian are difficult for me because of the Polish influence primarily. But yeah, as you get further south and further west, vocabulary particularly starts to diverge in strange ways.
Yeah. So we our first goal for this stream was to talk about your latest book. It's in in English. In German is Die Jahre des großen Schweigens, and in English it's Years of Great Silence. What is this book all about?
Basically, it's about the 14 years from 1941 to 1955 when the ethnic German population in the Soviet Union, they were all Soviet citizens at this time. They descended of immigrants into the Russian Empire between 1764 and probably 1871 is the last groups coming in. And so they had been there for at least 2-3 generations by the time of the Second World War. And some of them in the Volga, where the first settlements were going back to the late 18th century, when they were invited in by Empress Catherine II. During the Second World War, they're all rounded up, or at least those west of the Urals, those in Siberia and Central Asia, obviously, are already in the destinations of deportation. So there's no need to physically move them. And they are loaded onto train cars and sent eastward and dumped into these zones and are put under restrictions, particularly regarding their movement, and used for labor in agriculture and other sectors of the Soviet economy. But this is a punitive action aimed at the entire German population in a prophylactic manner. That is, they hadn't done anything. Particularly in the Volga, the Wehrmacht was still far away. But just in case, right, we'll punish them first, and then we'll worry about whether they might have actually collaborated or not. And so they are under special settlement restrictions and then mobilized into what's called the Labor Army now. That is a post-Soviet term, comes from the Russian Trudovaya Armia, or usually shortened Trudarmia. But this is basically people who are conscripted as if they were going into military service and then handed over by the People's Commissariat of Defense to the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, where they are sent to labor camps in the Gulag, but in separate sections of the camp from those who have been convicted through the court system. So there's no charge other than being ethnic Germans, and there's no sentence. It's to be to the end of the war, but most are not released until 1947, which is after to the end of the war. Some even later, and there's no right. So there's no charge and there's no sentence, and there's no trial. So they were just basically conscripted and sent to labor camps on the basis of their nationalnost.
I mean, I'm coming from the propaganda. I was filled with the majority of my lifespan, and I'm wondering, wasn't USSR, Soviet Union, or whatever you call it, a communistic or real socialistic country, which was supposed to be internationalistic, or at least indifferent towards nationalism, if not hostile towards nationalism. Why would such a country, which was supposed to be hostile towards nationalism, be nationalistically hostile?
Right. So there are a couple things going on, but yes, the 1936 Soviet Constitution bans any discrimination on the basis of race or nationalnost, and there are all kinds of violations of both the 36 Soviet Constitution as well as the RSFSR 37 Constitution and the Volga German ASSR 37 Constitution in the mass deportation ignored. But one of the things that happens is that with the way the Soviet Union has developed from 1923 on, with the policy of Korenizatsiya, where because the Bolsheviks, one of the reasons they almost lose the Civil War is that a lot of the non-Russians turned against them and wanted to break away and become independent, is they gave a lot of concessions, at least symbolically and culturally, to non-Russians. So you have this kind of pseudo-federation. You have a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, an Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic, a German autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, etc. But even so, they wanted to make these nations, national and form of socialist in content, to be socialist nations. And a lot of them really were not going in the mold historically. And the Germans were the largest such group in terms of particularly a diaspora with cultural ties beyond the borders of the Soviet Union, a history going back before their immigration into the Russian Empire, starting in 1764. And the fact that a number of the cultural traits like religion, most of them were devout Lutherans, there's a minority of Catholics and a smaller minority of Mennonites. Things like the traditional economic ways of life, economically, and other that were national characteristics, if you want to use that term, were not going away and becoming Sovietized fast enough for the government in Moscow under Stalin. And then finally, of course, there is the effect that, and this happens almost everywhere, but you have a group of people who are defined as having common ancestry and kinship, and some of them somewhere in the world do something you don't like, so you take it out on all of them, right? So some Germans in Germany did something the Soviet Union liked, notably invade the Soviet Union on 22nd of June 1941. So now all Germans are guilty, including the 1.5 million Soviet citizens of German ancestry.
Were there any, throughout the history you researched, were there any particular specific tensions between ethnic Russians and ethnic Germans in Soviet Union and before, and in what was then
so in the Russian Empire, the Germans were not only separate from the non-Germans, they were separate from each other. So Lutheran villagers did not associate with Catholic villages or Mennonite villages. So each one of these villages, and they're based upon their religious denomination, was basically separate. They did not associate with each other. The first time you start to have large-scale contact between the ethnic Germans and ordinary Russians, that is, people who are not specifically sent by the state to deal with them as part of the administrative apparatus, was after 1874 when they started conscripting ethnic Germans into the Russian army. So this is where they had their first kind of contact, although it was men only, with Russians and Ukrainians and others. So my great-grandfather for instance, didn't learn Russian. He spoke German as his native language, and he knew Polish and a little bit of Ukrainian. But he only learned Russian when he was conscripted into the Russian army and spent 18 months in it. And then they tried to mobilize him in the reserve to fight against Japan in 1904, and he walked out of the Russian Empire into Germany. But this was pretty typical, that there wasn't much learning of Russian language. It was decreed mandatory that it be taught in the village schools, which were run by the churches in Germany during the late Tsarist era, after a conscription began. But for a long time, for the first 100 years plus, most of the German colonists in the Russian Empire didn't speak any Russian, even as a second language.
How did this relations between the Bolshevik government and ethnic Germans in USSR influence the relations between Germany and USSR throughout the years?
Okay, so one of the things, as I said, that there was an attempt to, particularly after 1923, but it has some earlier origins, particularly with the German, to make cultural and symbolic concessions to non-Russian nationality. So the first national autonomous territory is the Volga German Workers' Commune, which is established 19th of October 1918 by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. And this is in part because they're having trouble with the Germans rising up against the Bolsheviks in villages like Warenburg. It's in part because the Germans don't want to give grain and horses and other goods to requisition committees run by the Bolsheviks. But also in long term, particularly when it's upgraded to full ASSR, the second highest administrative unit for non-Russian territory in the Soviet Union in 1924, they wanted to create a model for Germany and Austria, that this was a new socialist German nation, that this was a successful economic, cultural, and bellwether to the future, right? So the German workers in Germany and Austria could point out, we already have, the beginnings of socialist Germany out in the Volga River in the east, right? We can bring it here. Now that never really happened, but that was a big part of the Soviet thinking, with particularly the 24 upgrade to a full ASSR.
I'm calling to this speculation, but still, maybe some people will say that I have agenda behind it. Okay, I have an agenda, but I will call to speculation. How much of the Bolshevik thinking about this stuff was coming from the ethnic Russian, from Tsarist thinking, or monarchistic, or whatever, or how much of it was coming from the ideology of some other ethnic origin, which...
Yeah. So the Soviet Union initially, as I said, had different ideas, but because of the Civil War and the fact that lots of non-Russians fought to try and break away, they're successful in Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan for about 3 years. They're successful for a longer period of time in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And Finland and Poland maintain independent states despite the Second World War. So they feel, and particularly the one point man, because he's Georgian and not Russian, the commissar for nationality is Joseph Stalin. And one thing Stalin believed thoroughly is that you can get away with a lot if you let people speak their own language. So if you let them have communism in German, in this case, but it would also apply to Uzbeks or Ukrainians or any other non-Russian, right? You can do a lot to try and eliminate other aspects of their culture, as long as you give that one main concession. So this is one of the driving ideas, that how they categorize different nationalności, and also the territories and what right they had. So in almost all of them, you had education all the way up to university level in the titular nationality language as well as in Russian. So you could do all your schooling, theoretically in your native language, all the way up to a university degree. I'm not sure if it was possible to go beyond that. The candidate nauk and doctor nauk degrees, I think, did require Russian, but you could get pretty far still just doing it in your indigenous tongue if you really wanted to. So this was one of the concessions. So Stalin is one of the people that's important there. Lenin is as well. Lenin was the one who put his signature on creating the Volga German Workers' Commune in 1918, and that was the first national territory. The second one was the Bashkir ASSR. The German one is interesting in that they're a diaspora group. They're not indigenous to the Russian Empire. And then, of course, most of the Soviet government were not ethnic Russian. Lenin is considered a Russian by the Soviet government, but he actually had part Volga German ancestry as well as part Kalmuk ancestry, and one grandparent that was Jewish. So when you look at the first Politburo, there's one full Russian on it: Lenin, Stalin, who is Georgian, and then Kamenev, Zinoviev, Trotsky, and Solokonov. You've got 4 Jews on it. And up until about 1926, the Soviet Politburo was between 40 and 60% Jewish. Now, I don't know if there's anything specifically about that because the two figures you see for the ideas here before Stalin consolidates his power are Stalin, who is Georgian, and then Lenin, who is considered Russian, despite having a mixed background himself. Trotsky, Kamenev, and Zinoviev were crucial figures, but they were doing things other than nationality policies. And the nationality policies don't really change from this kind of development of socialist in content, nationalist in form, started in 1923 until the 1930s, really. You start to see during dekulakization, there's a lot of lower-level communist officials who have a very strong anti-German prejudice. Many of them also have strong anti-Polish prejudice. And, of course, by 1937, 1938, the Great Terror, there's a series of national operations. The largest is the Polish operation, the second largest, the German operation, but they're deliberately targeting the diaspora communities as being sources of espionage for their ancestral homelands.
Well, here's a viewer asking, was Stalin I actually don't know if he. I know some people say that he's a Georgian Jew or whatever, but I'm not sure. Do you have any?
The only thing I've heard is that he might possibly be Ossetian, not Georgian. But the Ossetians are similar to the Georgians. I mean, in some sense that they're in the Caucasus. I believe the Ossetian language itself is related to Persian, actually. So linguistically, Georgians and Ossetians are different. But most of what I've seen says he's Georgian. And this would fit in, there's one of the things before the Great Terror, and after it, what happens is you have a replacement of basically one group of NKVD, OGPU, back to the Cheka leaders who are from the area of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So Dzerzhinsky, who's Polish, is the first one. And then Menzinsky, although he becomes ill very early on, is de facto leader is actually Genrikh Yagoda, who was Jewish. And then Yezhov, the head of the NKVD during the Great Terror in 37 and 38, including the German operation, his Lithuanian on his mother's side and Russian on his father's side, but they're all coming from the area of the Pale of Settlement. And when Yezhov was removed in November 38 and Beria comes to power, he has a more diverse group. So the Jewish contingent had been almost 40% of the top NKVD officers in 34 and had gone down to 20% by the middle of 38. But by 39, it dropped to 4%. And that's largely Beria removing people loyal to Yagoda and Yezhov and replacing them with his own men, many of Georgian, many are Armenians from Georgia, like the Kobalov brothers from Tbilisi, but also more Russians and Ukrainians than had been under the previous leaders of the political police, who tended to be in that area of the former Soviet Union that was either ruled by Poland or Lithuania before the partitions.
From the modern point of view, it's pretty easy to make some assumptions about that time. But I was wondering, for example, you can obviously see the influence of Zionistic ideology on modern day America, for example, and you can obviously see influence of Jewish tikkun olam culture on modern day leftist ideology, for example. But to what extent, again, call for speculation, was this Bolshevism's influenced? You said around 40% were Jewish, but the thinking, to what extent do you think was the thinking influence?
Yeah, well, I mean, there is during the early Bolsheviks. So before Stalin consolidates power, and you have removal of the old Bolsheviks, most notably these three high-ranking Jews. Trotsky ends up being expelled out of the Soviet Union in this time, but Kamenev and Zinoviev will later be tried and executed in 36. But there is, promoted by Lenin and resisted by Stalin and some of the other Georgians, most notably Ordzhonikidze, this idea of the main enemy is great power chauvinism, which is another way to say Russian nationalism. And so you need to promote and support the non-Russians into power in order to keep the Russian center from overwhelming them, to prevent them from becoming a new czarist empire with a socialist cloak, right? So it was one of the reasons why Stalin said, well, we can get away with a lot. First, we just, not like the czar, you can do socialism in your own language, right? You want to do socialism in Polish, you want to do it in Kazakh, you want to do it in Buryat, that's all fine. But it has to be socialism, right? So there is that. Because pragmatically, obviously, the Russians are still over half of the population of the Soviet Union. And if you want to have a international global empire, right, that's the core. Not only are they the majority of the population, they're geographically the center. Moscow, St. Petersburg, which becomes Leningrad, even the big cities in the Far East of Vladivostok, Irkutsk, these are all predominantly Russian cities. And this is where the industry is. This is where arms are manufactured. This is where steel is made, right? So there is a kind of de facto entropy of the Russian core from the old Russian Empire in the Soviet Union that has to be recognized. But certainly the early Bolsheviks, Lenin, people like Trotsky, of course, pushing this internationalist idea, and it does have a specifically anti-Russian element at the beginning, and which really only goes away about 1936, which is the time that Kamenev and Zinoviev were tried and executed. But it's also the first time you see openly pro-Russian editorials in Pravda, and you start to see movement against certain national groups in the Soviet Union, particularly diaspora. So in 1936, all the ethnic Poles and Germans on the border with Poland are deported into Kazakhstan as special settlers. And in 37, all the ethnic Koreans in the Far East are deported into Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan to prevent the Japanese from infiltrating ethnic Koreans into the population. But then the Kurds are removed from the border with Azerbaijan, and of course escalates by the time you get to the Second World War. It's not just groups on the border, it's the whole populations, like with the earlier 37 deportation of the Koreans.
You kind of opened my eyes with that sentence that the greatest adversary was great power chauvinism, because for us in Slovenia, for example, although we're a lot more prone to NATO Atlanticistic propaganda. For example, Russia today has been banned for a while in our media space. What I have been able to figure out about, for example, Putin through the canals, it might be erroneous. But it seems that Putin is still following this same line. Wouldn't you say so? That Putin himself is following this line, that it's even in modern day Russia, it's kind of forbidden to speak about great Russia as in a great empire of ethnic Russians combined with other ethnicities and so forth. He even doesn't have guts to speak about it. It seems to me. He always says, yeah, Russia is a big empire, it's multicultural, it's multi-ethnic. He never says this is basically Russian country. What's your opinion on this?
Well, I think it had to do a lot with entropy, because even under the Tsars, the idea of Russia developed as an imperial idea, not a nation-state idea. Right? So the idea, and this, of course, gets, again, under the early Bolsheviks, right? You basically, you have pseudo-nation states in all of the other large nationalities. Right? You have Ukrainian, Soviet Socialist Republic. But the RSFSR is the territory that's left over after you carve out everybody else. It's a negative space, right? And so it's always been this idea, right, that it's an imperial state identity rather than an ethnic national identity, and therefore it has been able to, under the Tsars and the Soviets, and even today, to assimilate into its leadership people who aren't ethnically Russian, right? So people who are from these minorities that were conquered. Some going back to Ivan IV, he captured Kazan and Astrakhan from the Tatars, right? So Kazan is the capital of the Tatar Republic, the largest non-Russian group in the Russian Federation, right? They never assimilated. They're still nominally Muslim. The Tatar language still exists, right? They have a territory recognized in the constitution of the RSFSR, of the Russian Federation, just as it was in the RSFSR and the Soviet Union. All right. So the idea of a Russian nation state, like you have a Slovenian nation state or a Polish nation state, never developed because it was considered to be an obstacle to ruling effectively over the non-Russian minorities. And so even today, I think 20% of the Russian Federation are ethnically not Russian. Now, they're geographically on the borders, most of them, so the 20% is not as significant as it might appear just numerically, right? But if you go to the North Caucasus, there's Chechens, there's Ingush, there's Balkars, there's Karachites, there's Circassians, Dagestanis, all are citizens of the Russian Federation, but none of them are ethnically Russian. You have in the east the Buryats, the Yakuts, various smaller groups, the Evenki, the reindeer people, and then a bunch of groups in the Urals, the largest and oldest minority for Russia being the Volga Tatars, some of them which did convert to Russian Orthodox Church and become nobles in the Russian Empire. Others were communist in the Soviet government, right? But it never became Russian. It was always a distinct nationality. Unlike the Russians, basically a nation state without independence, whereas Russia is this imperial state idea that has elements of a nation state, like a language and culture, but never made the crossover from being, it's like as if the Austrians never lost their empire. We're still thinking of, we are the Habsburg Empire forever.
Yeah. And Yugoslavia, although a much smaller country and obviously not an empire in a true sense of the word, it was a sort of, it used to be a monarchy, a little monarchy, but still a monarchy. And it had a couple of little nations inside, and it used to be said that they tried to create a Yugoslav nation out of Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, and so forth, and they didn't achieve it.
Well, yeah, I mean, they didn't even try in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a state, but you could not enter your nationalnost as Soviet, right? On the census, they ask you, what is your nationalnost? You could not say Soviet. That was your citizenship, Gazdanost. So I believe in Yugoslavia, you could at one time put Yugoslav on the census, but only 4% did.
Yeah, not many people. It was said that the people with the most Yugoslav identity were the people that are today called Bosniaks. So the Muslim population in Bosnia, which was not as Muslim as are the Muslims from the Middle East. They were probably the most secular Muslims in the world, but they also liked to call themselves Yugoslav, which has its logic, to be honest.
Well, because they obviously weren't Croatian or Serbian, so what is left?
Yeah, it's pretty obvious why they were inclined as to be Yugoslavs. Yeah. But nowadays, I don't know. The people say that it's been that a strong Muslim identity has been created after Yugoslav wars in the 90s, which wasn't there ever before in the history.
No, and during the Second World War, the Ustashi claimed they were all Croatians of the Islamic faith.
Yeah, and Serbs say that they are basically Serbs. So, and to be honest, it probably to some extent is true, at least in genetic sense. Culturally, obviously not. At least not for centuries, but genetically, probably yes. Although Serbs and Croats are genetically also peculiar. To some
It's one of those examples of religion imposed by foreign empires. In the case of the Muslims, the Ottomans, effectively dividing people who are the same lineage and ancestry.
Yeah, probably. Who could know who created all these identities? Because you can also, some people will say now that I'm inclined to be more pro-Serbian, but you can see how Croatian identity has been hardly influenced by Catholic Church fighting against the Ottomans. For example, although Croats Croats, for the northern Croats, are, for example, genetically, phenotypically, even linguistically, much more similar to Slovenes than Dalmatians are, for example. Dalmatians look like more like Serbs, for example, and the north. But yeah, throughout the centuries, things change. Um, what I what I wanted to ask you was, yeah, for us in Slovenia, this propaganda or narrative or however you call it was um, pretty often, and it was that Germany basically caused all the conflicts in the 20th century. And the Germans basically attacked the USSR without any reason. So what I wanted to say is, to ask is, um, how did this conflicts between ethnic Germans and the government in the USSR influence any attacks that would be later on um, interpreted as in without reason?
So there's a lot of persecution of ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union, both in the beginning because they're wealthier, have more land, more successful in farming, but also going down to the ethnic basis because they have cultural connections with Germany outside of the territory of the Soviet Union that was part of the Russian Empire. So already you see in the 1921, 1922 famine, there's a lot of international organization, including by Germans from Russia in the United States, places like North Dakota, the Black Sea Germans, places like Nebraska, the Volga Germans, right, to provide famine assistance to relieve the effects of the 1921-22 famine, to prevent millions of people from starving to death, although millions do, including hundreds of thousands of ethnic Germans. But already here, there is an interest by the German population outside of the Russian Empire, people who were descended of Germans who left the Russian Empire during the Tsarist era and went to the United States. Also, the Mennonites from the Netherlands, religious connection, provided aid and assistance during this time. So this is a start. And then because of the Civil War, there's about 120,000 ethnic Germans that leave what becomes the Soviet Union and go to Germany. And about half of them, 60,000, stay. And some of them become quite influential. Georg Leibrandt, who was very influential as a scholar in the Weimar era, became a high-ranking official under Rosenberg in the National Socialist era, and then became again a very respected scholar, an ethnographer and historian of Germans in the Russian Empire, both in West Germany, the Federal Republic, and in the United States after the war. So he was one of the men that Rosenberg sent to the Wannsee Conference. So there was another very important Black Sea German scholar at this time, probably even more influential in terms of scholarship, Karl Stumpf. He was in the SS with a special commando to go and make reports on all the German villages in the Ukraine. And this is a kind of a source base for a lot of the genealogy and history research that was done from the 1940s up until the 1980s by Americans of German from Russian ancestry, Canadians of German from Russian ancestry. The Minister of Agriculture was also in the SS. Herbert Backe was from Georgia. The head of the 12th Sonderkommando and Einsatzgruppe D was an ethnic German from Azerbaijan, Helendorf. A number of them became popular. A number of them became fairly high-ranking officials in the NSDAP, the National Socialists, and this had some influence. So already Hitler is appointed chancellor in March of 1933. There is a famine raging in Ukraine, where there's a lot of ethnic Germans, and in the Volga-German ASSR. It's even worse. Something like over 20% of the population of the Volga-German ASSR dies in 1933 from hunger-related causes. Adolf Erd, who is from Saratov in the Volga, is an important figure in raising awareness in Germany. He has a pamphlet he puts out called Bruder in Not. He's also the author of another pamphlet on communist uprisings in Germany. He himself was from the Volga. Hans Steinarker, who was also important in raising awareness of the famine in the Volga-German ASSR in 1933, was from Austria. But it was well known, and there were still letters being sent out, censored, but often written in code, not only to Germany from Ukraine and the Volga, but also to ethnic German communities from these regions in the Midwest of the U.S., North Dakota for Ukraine in particular, and Kansas and Nebraska for the Volga region. So it was known in Germany, and there were activists in the NSDAP who were from the former Soviet Union, Georgia, Ukraine, the Volga, and they did take an interest in it and did have some of the superiors. So, for instance, Leibrandt was close to Rosenberg, and Rosenberg convinced Hitler to finally give the green light on deporting German Jews and Austrian Jews to ghettos in the East in September 1941. There'd been a delay of what to do with them, but it was specifically in retaliation for the deportation of the Volga Germans, which starts on 3rd of September 1941, and Rosenberg meets with Hitler on the 14th of September. 18th of September, green light is given for the SS to deport 60,000 German Jews into ghettos in Poland, Belarus, and Latvia.
Is there any German type of intelligentsia in America, or are Germans in America totally assimilated? Do you have any cultural clubs or?
It varies. So the Volksdeutsch, including the Russlanddeutsch, in the U.S. the term used German from Russia. They have actually, compared to most Germans, the Germans that came from Germany proper, area that became the Second Reich in 1871, are not have not preserved the heritage as well. But starting in the 1870s, mainly into the Midwest, you have the Germans from Russia. There's maybe 1 million people descent, but it's fairly well for the older generations preserved. So if you meet people that are older than my parents, who are in their 70s, they will generally still speak the original colony dialect from these areas, and they learned it from their parents and in churches growing up in the United States. There are two heritage organizations. One was founded in 1969, American Historical Society of Germans from Russia. It's mainly Volga German. It's based in Lincoln, Nebraska. It has a very nice museum and library on the subject. And the other one is the Germans from Russia Heritage Society, which broke off because it wanted more dealings with the Black Sea Germans in the Ukraine, Crimea, and Bessarabia. And it is based in Bismarck, North Dakota. It was formed in 1971. So those two organizations are still around, and they had close association with Stump and Leibrandt, the various the Landsmannschaft der Deutschen aus Russland in Germany. Also, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, with ethnic Germans in the Russian Federation, and also now Russian Federation more problematic, but a lot with the Kazakh Germans. So there's about almost 200,000 ethnic Germans still in Kazakhstan.
I know that many people say that there are some Ukrainian Jews from America that have interest in this Ukraine crisis or Russian aggression on Ukraine, for example, Blinken and Nuland. But how about American Germans? You say that there are many Germans with heritage from Volga area. Do they also have? Are they also opinionated about this crisis or this war?
The older ones are. A lot of the Black Sea German and the Dakotas is a big part, but they're spread out now. You have large communities in places like California, even. They have tended, in my experience, to be pro-Ukrainian and anti-Russian. But again, these are people that are fairly advanced in age. We're talking 70 and above. For people of younger generations, there's not that much interest. The assimilation has finally come my great-grandfather, the third or fourth generation. So I went to the 50th Jubilee for the American Historical Society of Germans from Russia. And there was one woman there with her children who was younger than me. She was in her 30s. She was from Texas. And I thought that was great. But other than that, I was the youngest guy at age 49.
And if it's not I don't know, if it's not too big of a secret, how are the relations between these older generations, between American Jews and American Germans, for example?
They're fairly good because, for the most part, there's some holdovers culturally. But by the time you get to my generation, I'm in my mid-50s, right? The American part seemed to overwhelm everything. The assimilation process is quite far advanced. And now it used to be, even up to the 1970s, in the United States, Germans from Russia that came from a Lutheran village still would not marry Germans from Russia that came from a Catholic village. That was considered the same as interracial marriage.
That's crazy. That's crazy a little bit. Interesting. So, do you have any final thoughts? Any additional information that you would like to share with us about your book and your work?
Yeah, well, I just got another royalty statement with very puny numbers on it for 2024. So it's still seemed to be selling less than 100 copies a year, which is below what I would like it to sell. Not because I care so much about the dollar, 1.13 euro royalty per book, but I'd like to have the ideas and the information spread more widely, since in some senses, the actual writing of the final book only took a couple months in 2021, but the research, I would say, it goes at least back to 2010 when I interviewed a bunch of elderly ethnic Germans in Kyrgyzstan who had lived through the Second World War and the era of special settlement and the labor army. So that would be at least 11 years in the making.
Okay. For those who don't know, Otto also has Substack, jotopohl.substack.com. He also has his own Patreon, Pohl Position. And please for all of you, I mean, it's obvious that all of us can afford his book. Please, for those who want to support Otto's work, please buy his book, share his book, promote his book, and that's oh yeah. One question left. It was what I asked you in the messages.
Oh, about the Templars in
About
Palestine. Yeah, so this guy claimed that there were German colonization efforts during World War One and World War Two, before World War One and World War Two, in Africa and the Middle East. But this is kind of confusing because, first of all, Palestine was never a colony legally of anybody. It went from being part of the Ottoman Empire to a League of Nations mandate under the British. Second of all, the German colonies in Africa, which you seem to be conflating, except for Namibia and to a lesser extent Deutsche Ostafrika, were not settlement colonies. But there is no German colonial administration in Palestine. What had happened in the Ottoman era started in 1868, which is actually before the first big wave of Jews, the first Aliyah. These German Christians started settling the Holy Land, and they called themselves Templars. And so they had some communities there from 1868 until the end of the Second World War, when they were all removed by the British before the main conflict between the Arabs and the Jews started. Now, a number of them were sent during the war to internment camps in Australia by the British. They had all of their property confiscated, all ended up with the Israelis. But interestingly enough, while Israel hasn't given a single penny to any of the Arabs it's dispossessed, the West German government refused to sign the final agreement for Holocaust reparations in 1962 unless the Israelis paid for all of the property they confiscated from the Templars. And so they ended up paying, I think it was 64 million Deutschmarks or something. And one of the guys who was a fervent National Socialist, I think he got personally a huge settlement from his lots of property from the Israelis. And you got to know, that's got to feel good. By this time he's in exile in Germany, but he's getting paid by the Israelis, and he never had to go through denazification.
Yeah, that's really funny. What was with the colonies of? I'm not a scholar. I haven't researched this topic, but when I studied philosophy, we had this pretty famous in this analytical philosophy circles around the world. He was half Croat, he was half Serb, and obviously working for Soros because he also had he worked at the Budapest Central European University, but he was a lefty and so forth. But he told us that there was this big dispute in Germany in 19th century that Germany didn't have enough colonies, or that it didn't have any at all.
They didn't have very many colonies compared to the British and French. So up until the Berlin Conference in 1880, they didn't have much of anything. And then they got Togoland, Cameroon, Namibia, Deutsche Südwestafrika, and what is now mostly Tanzania, but also Burundi, Rwanda, with Deutsche Ostafrika in Africa. They had wanted considerably more, but the British and French obviously didn't want the German to become a new power player internationally or even in the African continent. So, for instance, Togoland, and I'm familiar with this because I lived in Ghana for 6 years, in the western part of Togoland, the German protectorate became Eastern Ghana when it became when Ghana got independence. And so the British took it in World War I. So the Germans were only there from 1880 to 1914, 34 years. Now, 1884 to 1914, 30 years. They were there for a mere 30 years. But interestingly enough, you talk to people even my age, right? And they have a pretty respected opinion, the people from that area, of the Germans, particularly compared to the French, whom they didn't like at all. But even somewhat towards the British, who were, at least in the Gold Coast, one of the more benign colonial rulers, the fact that they left a lot of infrastructure, including a lot of money in the treasury for the Ghanaians when they got their independence in 57, unlike the French in Guinea the next year in 58, where they took the light bulbs out of the presidential palace. But you still see some German influence. There, for instance, is up in the mountains there's a cross that was put there by the German priest on 1st of September 1939. Still, it's a big iron cross on the biggest mountain in Ghana, which is a tiny hill. But the British weren't very happy, and they deported him as a result of because it was the day the Germans invaded Poland that he put it up. But there's I think it's University of Flensburg in Germany, but also Humboldt University in Berlin. They sent quite a few people to kind of do joint project between Germany and Ghana on the German colonial legacy in eastern Ghana that was part of the Togoland protectorate.
Yep. What I wanted to say before is that this professor had this interesting theory or hypothesis that about this dispute in 19th century, that there were basically two positions in the public. One was that no, Germany doesn't need colonies, and the other was yes, Germany has to go even to war for colonies. And he said that the main public figures who argued for this position were mostly Jews, the Ashkenazi Germans, and his hypothesis was his hypothesis obviously was left-wing ideology influenced, and it was wrong. But he said that this obviously turned them around against them.
Well, I know, for instance, a little bit about Togoland, but the colonial office there, they wanted to use Togoland as a replacement for cotton from the United States for the German textile mills, because you can grow cotton in Togoland. But unlike the British and Russians, they never could get the majority of their cotton needs for their industry fulfilled from their own colonies. But I don't remember any prominent Jews in the colonial office or people involved with colonialism in the late 19th, early 20th century in German Africa. One of the religious elements is that the Calvinists, the Basel missionaries, were German-speaking Swiss who were active in West Africa trying to convert it to Christianity. And they were influential enough in the colonial power that they banned usury. This is why Togoland never became a cotton colony that was successful like India or Egypt or Turkestan, because the Calvinist, the Basel missionaries said, it's okay to beat the Africans to take their cotton, but you cannot put them in debt slavery. That is a sin and you will burn in hell. And so they weren't effectively able to use debt to extract cotton. They had to literally physically take it out with once a year. And the Togolanders were like, okay, they beat us once a year to take the cotton, but at least we're not on the edge of starvation because we're in debt that has constant interest.
With this great joke or a tragic fact about history, I would like to thank you once again for accepting this invitation to coming to my podcast.
Thank you.
Any final thoughts?
I think, and maybe premature because I'm always kind of a premature anti-communist here, that there probably will be more coming out in the future, although I may not be around by that time. I'm not sure how long it'll take. Detailing exactly the kind of connections between the ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union and other countries in East Central Europe and the German policy during 1941. I think there's a lot of the violence going all the way down to individual levels, and things like Sonderkommando R, which was a SS detachment of ethnic Germans from around Odessa and in Bessarabia, of revenge against various communists, including, of course, Jewish communists, that really has not been looked at, even though it was well known at the time. As I said, as early as 1933, you have people like Adolf Ert and Hans Steinacher saying, hundreds of thousands of Germans in the Volga are dying of starvation under the Bolsheviks.
Okay. Dr. Pohl, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hopefully you'll get invited to more to podcasts with what much larger reach in the future. I sincerely have this wish for you, but thank you for coming to my
You're
podcast.
welcome.
Have a nice what's the time where you live?
It is now 2:40 in the afternoon, so I've worked from 5 a.m. to 1 p.m. at my day job. So it's meant that I got a little late today. I didn't get up till 3:30 in the morning.
So enjoy your afternoon. Get a good sleep afterwards. And for me, and to our Slovenian viewers, say good night and God bless. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Yeah.